Thank you, Beth. Yeah, my name is Madeline Straight. I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington. And I'm really grateful to be following Megan's talk because it really set the stage for my research. And I'm also just really excited to be here today and tell you guys a little bit about a project that I'm planning to conduct at Mount Rainier National Park this summer to understand the impact of tree encroachment on meadow plants and pollinators. And I will just say that there's a little bit of some repetition in my slides with Megan. I wasn't sure how much she was going to set the stage. And so I might move through some of those slides quickly just to make sure we don't get caught up on that. Okay, next slide, please. So Megan did a great job of setting the stage for why you should care about mountain meadows, but they're these high elevation meadows. They provide a wide range of habitat services, hydrologic services, and they really support a really big biodiversity of meadow plants and pollinators as well. Next slide. So my project is focused on the flowering plants that we find in meadows. And it's really important to know that majority of these flowering plants rely on animal pollinators for reproduction. My research is focused on insect pollinators, but there are other organisms that do pollination like birds. And really it's important if you wanna understand what's happening to these meadow plants is that you also understand what's happening to these pollinators and really understand their interactions as well. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to show you guys a snapshot of really the biodiversity of plants and pollinators in this system. So these are all photos I took last summer within the park, probably all within a month, within a pretty small area. And so there's really just a huge number of flowering plant species and a huge number of pollinators that visit them. And these are everything from bumblebees to smaller solitary bees to flies, wasps. And really a lot of these pollinators will visit many different flowering plants. And so understanding their interactions and how they're impacted by things like tree encroachment will be really important for thinking about conserving this habitat and these communities as well. Okay, next slide, please. So Megan really talked about why tree encroachment is occurring. So I'm gonna kind of skip through some of this. So next slide. Largely because climate varies along this elevational gradient where there's really lower temperatures and more precipitation in the form of snowfall at higher elevations has really created these areas that are dominated by these flowering herbaceous plants. While at lower elevations where it's warmer and the snow melts a lot earlier, you're having trees establishment. And so you have these trees at lower elevations and these meadows at higher elevations. Next slide. But with climate change, we're seeing increased temperatures and declining snowpacks. And so these areas that were previously more suitable for meadow plants are becoming actually climatically suitable for tree establishment. And so we've been observing trees establishing at these higher elevation locations with climate change. Next slide. Okay, this is just a quick slide to show that although this is occurring at Mount Rainier where I'm doing my work, this is also occurring globally. And really this meta-analysis of a bunch of different studies found that across the world, 52% of the sites showed tree line advancement, while only 1% showed tree line recession. And so we really are seeing trees move up in elevation on many of these mountains. Next slide. And this is actually the same image that Megan showed, but really this paper by Regina Rockford, who's actually going to be speaking later today, and Peterson found that at Mount Rainier National Park, these trees really were establishing with climate change in the meadows. Next slide, please. And so while research has really focused on this, how meadow encroachment is happening, where it's happening, why trees are establishing, we really don't know what that impact is having on meadow plants and pollinators. And it's really important to understand this because we're going to be existing in this period of time where there's these patches of meadows as these trees move up in elevation. And it's important to understand how these communities are responding. Okay, next slide. So trees specifically can impact meadows and meadow plants both directly and indirectly. And so they can impact them directly through several mechanisms. Next slide. So they can directly compete and deplete resources that meadow plants use. And so we're thinking about sunlight, water in the form of precipitation, but also soil moisture, and then also soil nutrients. And so a tree establishing in an area with flowering plants is going to directly compete with all of those flowering plants for those resources. Next slide. But trees can also impact meadows indirectly. And so, like Megan mentioned, trees are establishing in areas with earlier snowmelt, but also trees in a meadow will prevent the accumulation of snow on the ground, which reduces that snowpack. And trees emit irradiation, and so they actually help melt out the snow in and around a tree. And so both of these things end up actually leading to earlier snowmelt as well, which has this positive climate feedback on that meadow community. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to tell you guys what I am planning to do this summer within the national park. And I want to start by saying that this is not currently approved, but I'm planning on submitting permits and still really wanted to hear some feedback and get some suggestions on these ideas at the early stage. And so my plan is to really understand the impact of this tree encroachment on herbaceous flowering plants and pollinators. And to do this, I'm going to be planning to set up paired plots at multiple sites across the park. And I'm looking for sites where we will have areas where there's meadows without tree encroachment and very close by meadows where there is minor tree encroachment. And when I'm thinking about minor tree encroachment, I'm referring mostly to saplings and seedlings. So this stage of encroachment before the trees have really grown to their full size. And the goal of these paired plots is to really understand how tree encroachment is impacting them without thinking about other variables. And so I'll be trying to find communities that are really similar in terms of the composition of plants, flowering plants, except for this difference in tree encroachment. And then within each of these plots, I will be setting up some transects and monitoring the plants and insects and their interactions. Next slide, please. And so the things that I'll be really focusing on is the floral community. And so I'm planning on measuring the identity and abundance of all of the flowering plants in these plots. And then I will also be monitoring the pollinating insect community by setting up some potentially some blue vein traps. So these are traps that really attract pollinators. And one of the tricky things about monitoring insects is that a lot of these smaller bees and flies, you really need to look at them under the microscope to identify what species they are. And so you have to destructively sample, you have to kill these insects in order to do that. And the other tricky thing is that it's hard to sometimes catch some of these cryptic insects. And so these traps actually provide a mechanism to fully capture that entire community. And that will provide us a better way to really understand what pollinators are present in both these meadows that aren't encroached and the meadows that are. And then I will also be observing plant-pollinator interactions. And so within each of these plots, I will look at all of the plants that are actively in bloom within a sort of segment, so like a 1 by 2 meter segment. And then I will look at the flowers, and any pollinator that is observed visiting that flower, I will capture and take it back to the lab to identify to a finer taxonomic level what pollinator that was or what insect that was. Next slide. And so the goal of this is to really understand what plants and what pollinators are found both in Mount Rainier, just in the meadows generally, but then also in these areas that are not encroached in the areas that are. And the goal of this is honestly largely to help provide some information about the impact to this. And we're hoping that that tree encroachment isn't super detrimental, but that we might be able to actually still keep some of these plants and pollinators communities within this period. And so I'll be measuring all the identity of species, so how many species there are of plants and pollinators in these two different plots, as well as the relative evenness. So this is the number of individuals within each of those species, and overall the total abundance. Like, are we seeing a total decrease in the number of plants and pollinators with tree encroachment? Next slide, please. And then with the observing plant-pollinator interactions, it will really allow me to disentangle which pollinators are visiting which plants and with what strengths of intensity. Next slide. And this is really, really helpful because it allows us to understand for specific plants of interest which pollinators are really pollinating those plants. And it provides us information for conservation in terms of which pollinators are important for those plants, and then vice versa for pollinators that we care about. We can think about which plants are really providing the resources that those pollinators are visiting. Next slide. And then there's also these patterns of interactions can be really important for understanding community persistence. And so I will be measuring a few metrics of these interaction networks to understand how these communities are expected to persist, and if there's really big differences in the types of interactions we're seeing in these encroached meadows. Next slide. One thing that this will just talk on, like at the very end of Megan's talk, is I am proposing to potentially remove small saplings and seedlings from these meadows as a potential conservation method. This is really something that I think is difficult to think about. I mean, removing trees is hard. It's removing an aspect of the environment, but it might be one of the only ways that we can actually preserve these meadows without doing something like fire to really get rid of these trees. And so one thing I'm potentially going to propose, we'll see if it gets permitted, next slide, is basically adding a third site where I remove some of these small saplings and look at the effect of that removal on plants and pollinators to see if that helps restore some of that resources and that biodiversity. Next slide, please. So really the goal of this project is to help the National Park Service understand who composes these plants and pollinator communities, who's interacting with whom, and then how tree encroachment is impacting those interactions and those communities, and maybe tease out a potential conservation method that we might be able to use to preserve these meadows. Next slide. And I just want to quickly acknowledge my advisor, Barry Brosi at the University of Washington, Beth Fallon with the National Park Service, and another professor, Yannicka Hill-Ridge-Lambers, for their really great help with the project ideas and design. And I would open this up to any questions and also any suggestions with regards to this project. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Madeline. That's really exciting. And I also I love the pictures, and Sarah from San Juan is excited to have you start working over there.
I've actually thought about going up to Yellow Island because that's one of the islands where they've been, managing it as a meadow. And so I've thought about going up there and maybe doing a project up there to look at something similar.
Great. Yeah. And really, really illustrative slides. I'm really excited for all just the beautiful flowers in your plots. There's a question in the chat. What is the time frame for your study? Just 1 year, or what are you thinking about?
Ideally, I would do this for like 3 years. It's all a matter of like funding, if I can get funding for my research. I think to understand fully the impact of tree encroachment, specifically if I was able to test the method of removing the small trees, I'd really want to follow those sites for several years. Currently, I'm planning to do it for sure 2 summers. It's still up in the air whether or not I can get enough funding for the second summer, but I do think that multiple years of this would provide the most useful information.
Yeah, so we love to hear long-term monitoring. And Sally from Mount Rainier says, how many pollinators do you estimate would be removed from the ecosystem through destructive trapping?
So the traps are definitely something that even I have mixed feelings about, because it's hard for these, these pollinators that I care about. It's hard to say, okay, we have to kill them to really understand them. I think specifically, if I plan to set out these traps for no more than 24 hours. And so you actually only are you're hopefully getting a representative sample, but not actually destructively sampling that many individuals. And then one problem also is that often with like the observations, you don't see some of the pollinators that are a little bit more cryptic, or the ones that are pollinating at night. And so by actually setting out these traps, you can capture those individuals as well. I don't have the exact estimates off the top of my head, but people have used very similar trap methods, and it doesn't have a large impact on the community. Specifically, if you're only setting them up for 24 hours, you're not capturing that many individuals, and you're really, really getting at really the community breadth, not just the depth.
And then I think we have time for just one more question. John asks, are you considering pollinated phrenology? So like early season versus late season species?
Yeah, that's definitely something. So I'm trying to get out into the field like right as the snow melts for all of my plots, and then stay through at least before once the flowers start drying up in the end of the season, to really make sure I am capturing that entire flowering season. One potential problem with monitoring the insect community really early on is that you have a lot of bumblebee queens foraging really early in the season, and you don't want to be killing the bumblebee queens with those traps. And so I have been thinking about different ways to sort of monitor the insect community earlier in the season when the bumblebee queens are out sampling, so that I can avoid putting out traps and really destructively sampling bumblebee queens. But the plan is to really try to capture the entire phenology of the season in terms of insects as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's a really exciting talk, and it's interesting to think about the ways that the plants will shift, and then the pollinators will shift, or how one will precede the other. So excited to see more of your work.